Hi everybody, welcome back to another edition of Psychology, still not in my kitchen, back in the classroom today. I'm Mrs. Sarah Ryan, and today we are exploring as part of our cognition unit in AP Psychology, we are continuing today by looking at intelligence. So intelligence is probably one of the most controversial topics in psychology, as studying intelligence and how we utilize the idea of intelligence has some pretty historical significance in the United States as well as around the world. So first of all, real important right off the bat, intelligence is a socially constructed concept. It is something that we as humans have devised to identify differences amongst one another, and that we have taken this idea of intelligence, which is an abstract concept, and we apply it to one another as if it were a concrete thing about us. Like we say things like how tall we are or how much we weigh, but then we also say like how intelligent we are, and that's not really a thing. Like we've made that up, right? Intelligence is abstract. And so today we're going to explore in this particular video some of the definitions that we use to describe what do we really mean by intelligence. So first of all, we say that intelligence is the ability to learn from experience, solve problems, and adapt to new situations. Okay, so let's break down that definition a little bit. So we said first, it's our ability to learn from experiences. Look, if you try and fail and yet you keep trying the same thing over and over and over again and you're still not getting anywhere, guess what? Probably not smart, right? So the idea of learning from experience, saying, ow, the stove is hot, maybe I shouldn't touch it anymore, like that is a sign of intelligence. I understand that there are consequences for this behavior. I change my behavior. Like that is a smart thing to do, right? The other one, of course, is problem solving. If I have a vaccine to stop a worldwide pandemic and yet it requires massive amounts of cold storage, I got to figure out how I'm going to get that to people. That's a problem, and if I can figure out logistically how I can make that happen, that's problem solving, and that's a really important element to this idea of intelligence and being intelligence, that I can figure out how to deal with a problem. I can overcome that problem. And then finally, and this is a real kicker, being able to adapt to new situations. We know that adaptation has always been a major element of survival in human beings as well as other species. That if my environment changes and I just keep plugging along as if nothing has changed, I'm very likely going to die out. I'm very likely not going to be able to survive. And so when we are faced with new challenges and we're faced with new situations, when we can adapt to that situation, that is a sign that we are in fact intelligent. We can again overcome those problems. And so this idea of intelligence is all three of these components. That's really what we think of when we think of somebody as being intelligent. But often when we think of intelligence, we think about like being in school and, getting straight A's and stuff like that. And that's just not quite it, okay? And so that's actually what psychologists have been looking at in terms of what do we really mean by intelligence. So one of the biggest debates with intelligence in trying to identify what intelligence is trying to assume that not everyone would necessarily have the same kind of chutzpah, right? The same kind of element to intelligence and yet still be able to survive, be able to problem solve. How do we go about identifying this in a very diverse population of a species? So Charles Spearman is one of our first psychologists in looking at intelligence, is going to debate that all people have the same element of general intelligence that he referred to as G. And he utilized factor analysis to kind of see like these clusters of mental abilities where you had some people who had very strong verbal intelligence. They, could speak really well, they could convey their ideas appropriately. Other people being able to manipulate their environments, being able to navigate their environments, being able to design things, and still others being able to reason logically. And so starting to see that, all people have this kind of, basic element of intelligence running through them, but then seeing like intelligence might actually be in these kinds of clusters of different ideas. And so the psychologist that really takes this idea and runs with it is a psychologist by the name of Howard Gardner. So Gardner was interested in the fact that there's a population of people who had various types of mental and physical disabilities, and yet could still really excel in some kind of certain element. And he's really specifically referring to those with autism who also experience something known as savant or savant syndrome. So sometimes persons with autism who have difficulties in their social emotional intelligence, if you will, as well as cognitive abilities, can be really, really fantastic at a very specific thing that one might really consider to be intelligence. So for example, there is a very famous savant named Kim Peek who is able to memorize things like statistics or numbers-based information. So like phone numbers, for example, or baseball statistics. And sees them one time and clutches onto them and is able to tell you all this information, and yet this is a person who really can't take care of himself, not being able to live independently. And so as a savant, the question becomes, well, is this person intelligent? And Howard Gardner is going to take these types of case studies to make the argument that all people have intelligence, and yet we might excel in different elements of intelligence, and what he referred to as Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. So the theory of multiple intelligences is that all people have intelligence, but some excel in certain areas of intelligence more so than others. And he broke down the categories as such. So he identified people who had a verbal linguistic type of intelligence, so somebody who reads very well, is able to write well, somebody who understands vocabulary, able to express themselves appropriately. And then individuals who have logical mathematical intelligence, so somebody who understands their algebraic formulas and algorithms and all kinds of things like that. Then a musical intelligence, somebody who is able to understand rhythm, being able to understand how music can be composed and put into various fashions. A spatial awareness, so somebody who's able to navigate, being able to design, being able to visualize things inside of their mind and then actually be able to reproduce that out into the real world, like a real spatial intelligence. A bodily kinesthetic intelligence, where I can manipulate my body and make it do what it is that I really want to do to achieve some sort of end. And then he also identified an intrapersonal versus an interpersonal intelligence. Intrapersonal intelligence is an intelligence about oneself. I understand myself, I understand my wants and my needs, I have a good handle on myself mentally and my capabilities, whereas an interpersonal intelligence is one who is very good socially. They understand social cues very well. They understand how to read the room. They can understand various facial expressions and how different people relate well to one another. And then he also identified a naturalistic type of intelligence, somebody who understands nature, is able to identify plants and animals and understanding how to track things in nature. He also proposed an existential type of intelligence, which actually isn't on my slide here, but this is one of like understanding like the meaning of life, or life and death, and kind of this spiritual sort of element about ourselves. And so Gardner's just making this argument that to be intelligent doesn't necessarily mean to be so academically inclined. Because if we looked at this list and we think about like American school and where does one succeed, well, it would be somebody who is verbally linguistic and logical mathematical. And yet we recognize that these other types of intelligences still have value and that they still matter. And that's really the argument that Gardner's making here. Now, some people feel like he is really too specific. And so one of those is Robert Sternberg, who is also going to have a theory of multiple intelligences, but this is much more simplistic. He called it a triarctic theory, where you have an analytical, a practical, and a creative intelligence. This is kind of like the whole street smart versus book smart type of argument, where being analytical, that book smart mentality, whereas a practical is much more like being street smart, being able to understand how the world works, kind of a thing, and being creative. Now, another theory of intelligence that's worth mentioning is one of emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence would be able to understand and perceive emotions in other people. So like being able to recognize facial expressions and the emotions that are being conveyed in those, as well as the emotion that you might hear in a song or read about or see in a story, that you can convey this kind of emotional experience with that. That you can understand emotions, you can predict when an emotion is going to happen, and then being able to change or manipulate yourself. So for example, as a teacher, if I have a student sitting in class who is appearing upset, how do I handle that situation? How do I potentially de-escalate the situation in which there's a positive outcome for the students as well as myself, even though they're very clearly upset? As well as being able to manage one's own emotions. Not only understanding emotions in other people, but understanding my own emotions and being able to appropriately engage those emotions. So being able to understand that I might be feeling a particular way, but that's not appropriate for my colleagues, or being in the classroom and being around other students, that being able to manage those emotions in the various situations that a person is. As well as being able to use your emotions for types of personal gain. Now, some argue that a person who has really high emotional intelligence, that we see that as being very successful in different types of careers, marriages, parenting, even though somebody might be academically more intelligent. So for example, if you think about a career like a teacher, where in a high school level, you have a whole lot of information that you need to know in order to convey that to other students. But if you think about what would really make a great high school teacher and be in the classroom, is somebody who can manage the classroom, somebody who makes people feel at ease, you feel at home being in that classroom. There's good vibes, right, that are going on in that classroom, and it's not something where like the teacher is angry or the students are upset. Like, we have this kind of emotional control, and that emotional intelligence is what would play a role in that. However, some people really argue that, we've taken the idea of intelligence way too far here, right? That emotions aren't really something to be intelligent about. But that's part of how psychology works, that we make these different arguments about what really we mean by being intelligent. And then finally, we also identify there's an element of creativity, in that in general, when we look at what does it mean to be creative, there is a positive correlation between creativity and academic ability, where people who have really high levels of academic ability tend to also have really high levels of creativity, but only up to a certain point. And so that might be where, like in the academic setting, I have students who appear to be really intelligent, And if I give them a project, for example, they might come up with something really, really creative in their project, and part of that might be that intelligence element. But again, that could be making the argument that intelligence has again gone too far. So in our next lesson, we're going to talk about how we measure intelligence. Until then, thanks for joining me.